Hello, I'm Simon. It's very nice to see everyone here today. It's my first time in Croatia. It's a really lovely, lovely country to visit, somewhere I'll definitely want to bring my family back to. It's my first time going to a conference with a beach outside, which is awesome. So, I think I might just get this working. That's it. So, I run a digital agency in the UK called Studio 24. We do things like digital strategy, we design and build web apps and websites for our clients, and we have a really strong focus on inclusive design and accessibility within the agency. We're based in Cambridge, and this is the office, but we have a few staff based in Europe as well, in Belgium and Portugal. This was our last studio day when we got everyone together a couple of months ago. We work with quite a few different types of companies, and we're quite broad set over the years we've been running, but over the last 5 or 6 years it's stuff like public sector, government sites, and not-for-profit organisations as well. And the topic of this talk is we started working with W3C in 2020. So, just to touch on what I'm kind of talking about today. Essentially today I'm talking about redesigning w3.org, which is the W3C website, and how it kind of changed us as an agency. So the talk's in 3 sections, and we wanted to touch first on how we worked with W3C and our experience of that, and how things are different from the average client we work with. A few of the project challenges we encountered and what we did about them, and then what we learned by the end of the process. So working with W3C. The first thing, of course, is I've been saying this word W3C quite a lot, and I don't know how many of you are actually aware of who W3C is. I know it was touched on in Sam's talk just now, but before today, can you stick your hands up if you knew who W3C was, or is? Cool, a few, which is good. Basically, W3C stands for World Wide Web Consortium. They're a kind of standards body, an industry body within the web, a really important one. It's been around for over 30 years. They were founded in 1994 by Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who basically invented the web and what we use today. They essentially create standards that the entire web is built on, things like HTML and CSS. Essentially, they help define what the web platform is that we build all this exciting stuff on top of. So obviously quite a big deal for us, having worked in the web for 20 years or so. Really interesting client to be working with. So they define themselves like this on their website. We develop standards and guidelines to help everyone build a web based on the principles of accessibility, which means the web is available for everyone, internationalisation, so everyone can understand it, and privacy and security, so you can trust it, which is obviously the topic of the last talk. These all kind of come together into their kind of ethos of creating a web for all, which essentially underpins all the work they do at W3C. So back in November 2019, I spotted this tweet. They essentially just put a public announcement out looking for help redesigning their website. Didn't take me long to realise that would be quite an interesting thing to actually pitch for. Didn't have much expectation we'd actually win it at the time, of course. About 32 agencies responded from across the world, some tiny little agencies. We're a fairly small one, I guess, really. Like, we call ourselves a kind of mid-sized agency, about 17 people. And lots of big ones as well, some quite well-respected names in the industry. We went through this process where they kind of interviewed us and we chatted, and then they shortlisted down to about 3 agencies, and then we managed to win the thing, which were announced in February 2020. So one question some people ask is, why didn't they just do it themselves? They obviously know HTML and CSS since they write the specs for them, so they must have experts who are able to build websites. Well, W3C is a mix of lots of experts, staff and volunteers who all work for creating these standards. There are lots of experts in very specialised fields. We talked to quite a few of them who are like really, really expert in certain areas. Things like accessibility, internationalisation, CSS. The privacy sandbox stuff, which was mentioned in the last talk, is one of the things that also W3C are involved in. But a web project needs to bring all these different things together into one kind of cohesive whole to create a website that works for the users and obviously the organisation. So we have specialisms that W3C don't have, things like user experience design, information architecture, being able to help advise on how content should be organised. These are things they weren't so strong in within W3C. And also, like lots of big organisations, they are very, very busy all the time. And the core people we work with, there's not huge numbers of them either. There's lots of projects and lots of demands all the time. So obviously, like most clients, it makes lots of sense to outsource this stuff. I wasn't very aware of how W3C worked before we actually worked with them. I was aware of what they did, and I kind of keep in touch with lots of standards. Coralie Messier, who's the head of communications at W3C, so one of our key clients on the project, she published this blog post not so long ago, just kind of explaining how W3C works. On the left, you've got essentially 52 working groups, which are split into lots of different volunteers, members, and invited experts who all kind of work to create these standards and work on them. So it could be big companies like Google, and lots of experts in the field, obviously. Something like 15,000 people are involved in creating the standards for W3C, so it's a huge number of people. On the top right, you've got the actual core staff who are employed by W3C. It's a quite small number in comparison of the rest of them. And they obviously work to create these standards, which I'm not going to touch on today. The actual W3C team is split into a number of different groups. People, deciding what kind of strategy W3C should be working on. Supporting the members. I mean, almost all of their funding comes from paid members, so that's really essential for them to kind of carry on their work. And people support the standards process and help that kind of move along smoothly. And then you get a few people who are just more involved in W3 itself on the operations side. We ended up working just with two sections, really. The communications team, which is headed up by Coralie, as I mentioned earlier, and the systems team, who are essentially the IT and the developers. And they're the ones that maintain the w3.org websites and essentially all the infrastructure that sits on. And they're a fairly small team. It was 4 or 5 people who were involved in the kind of core team who we worked with, where there's lots of other people we kind of chatted to within W3C. So how did we end up working together? How did it kind of differ from normal clients? And the first obvious thing to note is that the actual project started in March 2020, and obviously something very big happened in the world. Back when we started, we were based in an office in Cambridge, and we had flexible working, so people occasionally worked at home, but most of the time everyone was together. And this is our whiteboard wall, which we had on the side of one of our rooms, where the team kind of got together, wrote lots of ideas down, things to ask the client, project risks, this kind of stuff. And that lasted about a week until we had to close the office, and we were never to return to that office. I think it's been knocked down now, and there's a bunch of flats there instead. So very quickly we turned to doing what everyone else did, of course, which is working online and finding our way in this kind of new remote first kind of way of working. This is one of our team meetings back from May in 2020. So adapting to full remote was difficult. I mean, obviously there's a pandemic going on as well, so we had to kind of support the staff quite a lot, give them flexibility. Some people needed time off for various different reasons, and as the owner of a business, it took me a while to try and work out the best way to support the team. So time was really, really disrupted in the first month or two of the W3C project. We had a few team members chatting to them, but quite a few of us weren't able to be involved, which made it a bit tough start. But W3C are a distributed organisation. They've been doing this for decades, so it's really helpful to work with them. Coralie, she wrote some remote working standards, which are probably public on the web, I'm sure, back in 2005. And I think recently they published some standards on how to make remote meetings more accessible as well, which is really interesting. So they ran things like really effective meetings. They read stuff in advance, which most of our clients often don't do. Asking useful questions and sharing useful notes afterwards. They had a bunch of kind of ways of working that was really helpful. So in some ways, they were the perfect client to work with in a pandemic. We ended up talking to people all over the world. The core team are based down in France, at a research campus called Ersim. But there are people in Canada, Japan, US, all over really. Apart from having to kind of line up time zones occasionally, online meetings worked really well. So one thing that's quite different to most of our clients is that W3C, they operate with this consensus-based decision-making model. So generally in their work, they try and get as many people as possible to input on decisions before they make them. So this is essentially how the standards process works, but they kind of applied it to some of the big decisions we had to make in a project. Small stuff, day-to-day stuff, obviously the core team were able to just decide on, so things ran fairly smoothly there. But quite a few big decisions, W3C were really keen to kind of involve quite a large amount of people and the rest of the community, which is different for us. We're not obviously used to that kind of way of working with an agency. And some of these things are things that agencies would just, decide themselves while building stuff. But as I said, we had to adapt to how they worked. One example of this is deciding how we build the front end, essentially the HTML and CSS. So this is mostly around the CSS approach, which for those that aren't aware is essentially how you do the design and the layout of web pages. Given W3C published the standards on CSS, they wanted to be seen to be using best practices, and they want people to be able to learn from the kind of stuff we do. And yeah, that kind of thing isn't usually what you talk about with clients. Usually agencies have their own way of doing things. Or you might be constrained by the tools you use. So basically we had two choices, Bootstrap or our own CSS approach, which we'd been working on this thing called Apollo, which is what the team called it. Kind of was created a couple of years before working with W3C. They're just a set of patterns and components that help us kind of build out good quality, accessible websites. Bootstrap, however, was something that the systems team were familiar with. It's obviously really well supported in the industry, loads of documentation, loads of people know how to use it, and it's got lots of stuff in it as well. We wanted to avoid things like, I mean, we'd worked with some of these framework systems before, like Foundation, quite a few years ago now, and we found we'd hit various problems with flexibility and not quite be able to implement what we wanted to in these things. We also wanted to avoid bloat and make sure things were performant and fast. And things like accessibility was really important to us as well. We wanted to be able to control that. And as I mentioned, W3C wants to be seen to be using latest front-end technologies as well, not just being constrained by whatever the old version of Bootstrap you might be stuck on is doing. So that process, we first had to kind of write, publish our thoughts on this working of the open site about what we thought the pros and cons of the two different approaches were. This is the article that was written by Nikki, our front-end lead developer. I'll talk a bit more about the working of the open stuff in a bit. And then we had a big call with lots of people, something like 30 or 40 people, I think it was, to us and the core team at W3C, a bunch of people on the advisory board, which is essentially the management of W3C, effectively, and then invited experts who kind of came in as well. And we even had a guy called Bert Boss, who is basically one of the founders of CSS. He essentially created it with others as well. So when we went into that call, it's a little bit intimidating. And things like, imposter syndrome kind of raised its ugly head a tiny bit. But it turned out they're a really nice bunch of people. Once we started talking shop, it became a lot easier. We learned just to have confidence in your expertise and just be open and have a positive attitude when meeting lots of people. Chances are everyone's kind of wanting the best result at the end of the day. So we ended up choosing our own kind of custom approach. I think W3C preferred the fact that we can keep it leaner for CSS and have a kind of more, and make sure accessibility is really focused on. So we essentially created some projects which ended up being open source. So Apollo was what it was originally called, as I mentioned, and this became the basis for the HTML and CSS on the W3C side. And it's not exactly a design system at this stage, it's just really patterns and components and ways of building HTML and CSS. That kind of evolved after we finished the W3C project, which we had done lots of work in, and there's loads of accessibility testing. This kind of evolved, and the team decided to rename it to Amplify because it had changed so much. And it's essentially the same thing, just a lot better than it used to be, effectively, and has a bunch of really well-tested accessibility components as well, which is really helpful. And that's what we now use for all of our client work. So it's kind of helped us quite a lot as a business. And as we kind of iterate this, hopefully some of that stuff can work back into the W3C side. So working in the open. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but essentially it means when you're working in a project, kind of sharing your work publicly as you move forward. I don't know, has anyone actually raised any hands? Has anyone worked in the open on any projects? No? So it's not something we're used to as an agency. W3C is how they work all the time. So everything that they do is essentially published as they go along, down to even meeting notes a lot of the time. Which makes sense for obviously developing standards that have to be accepted by the web. For us as an agency, we had to kind of get used to that way of working. So we tried things, obviously things like the code was public. That was kind of a fairly easy thing to do. So public GitHub repos where most of his code's based. We had a working in the open website where we actually published for work as we went along. Things like documents, design ideas, prototypes, built templates. W3C also tried to gain feedback from the community throughout the process. They kind of shared stuff on their blogs and Twitter and places like this. Most of the stuff we shared, we kind of had some review process first. We didn't share everything we did as we went along. We felt that was kind of necessary for us to kind of check what we were doing before we published it. We wanted it to kind of feel like it was right rather than just quick and dirty. This is for working with the open website, which we published to basically between April 2020 and April 22. But it was quite difficult. So, I mean, we'd taken a decision to do this working the open stuff in our own time, not kind of charging it to W3C. But it took a lot of time to do. And even things like writing week notes took quite a bit of time. There was kind of perceived pressure from the community. We felt like we needed to make sure what we published was right, rather than just, as I say, publishing rough and dirty stuff. In reality, there wasn't a huge amount of critical stuff from the community, which was good. And maybe on reflection, we should have just published more kind of draft stuff as we went along. But we also obviously had other projects we were working on in the agency, so balancing this kind of work against that was tricky at times. It wasn't the only way we work and any way we do things. So there's also kind of responding to the community. Sometimes things popped up on Twitter or in other places. And some of the team kind of felt some pressure of, didn't particularly want to reply publicly about some of this stuff. So as the leader of Studio 24, I just decided to kind of do that stuff instead and leave the team free just to get on with the work, which seemed to work fairly well. So our front-end team lead, I mentioned Nikki, who worked on most of the kind of Amplify CSS code. She wrote this nice blog post at the end of the project about her experiences, which is really interesting. There's a link on our website there. And she kind of framed her role by the end as curating all these front-end best practices and kind of bringing them together onto the W3C site and hoping that that might share it with a wider audience because of who they are, which I thought was a nice kind of positive takeaway for her to have at the end of the project. So I'll just talk now about 3 challenges that we had on the project. First one was the scope. So there was a lot to consider in a project. I mean, W3C's been around for, the website itself has had stuff added to it for over 30 years. It's not one website, it's hundreds, all kind of patched together using different systems to run them. The core website as it stands is kind of a patchwork of various different things. And there's lots of content, something like 2 million web pages or so. And so there's a hell of a lot of kind of technical stuff we had to review. This is just a touch of some of the things we looked at in the planning phases. Some of these things agencies would just decide what you're doing, like an agency might have a CMS you just use. But that wasn't really the case on this project, and quite a lot of these things we had to go into a fair bit of depth. And there's stuff on the Working the Open site about most of these things. And the quality bar for the project was really high, and that was partly us, because we knew who we were working with. W3C is kind of important to us. We wanted to do a good job, obviously. And partly W3C, they kind of interrogated quite a lot, and we had to talk to lots of people at lots of stages in the project. And it felt a bit like we had to justify all of our decisions quite a lot of the time. A lot more than the average client, which obviously took a lot longer time to work on. And W3C wanted to involve the community as well. It wasn't just about them getting what they wanted. They didn't want to just dump a website out onto the world without consulting with anyone. They wanted to give opportunity for people to actually feedback. In the end, this was mostly people involved in W3C already. We didn't get huge amounts of external feedback from people who were, not connected to W3C at all. It would be nice to see more of that. Once the beta site is kind of fully launched, which is currently kind of being finished off by the W3C team, chances are we'll probably get a lot more feedback. I guess people are busy. They often, don't have the time to respond to things where you see bits and bobs of progress. But, W3C did try to engage the community, which is good. So the project took a lot longer than we thought. We thought it'd be just over a year or so maybe, but it ended up being 2 years. We were involved in most of the work. A lot of that was because of the in-depth nature of the stuff we had to look at. So in that first phase, and we started reviewing all these different areas of the project, you kind of go down rabbit holes sometimes and end up lots of work kind of investigating these things. Some of it was the volume of work. There's a lot of things to cover. We supported W3C by extending the project, but we had to stop at some point, which is what we did around April, May time earlier this year. And we're still keeping in touch with them as they kind of finish bits off. We work together with W3C as well. So their systems team, as I mentioned, have a bunch of developers, and they know Symfony really well, which is their kind of chosen kind of web framework. And they helped build some of that with us, which is really helpful, and it kind of was a good use of kind of splitting up the time we have available on the project. They helped build out parts of a Symfony front-end website effectively. It had a kind of headless CMS model of the website, integrating the templates we'd built for them. And that worked really well, actually, and it was a really good experience. It's not something we often do with clients, but when we get the opportunity to work with internal teams, it's really nice. And it also helps things like knowledge transfer, because they need to maintain this stuff in the future, and the easiest way to do that is to actually work on stuff. So near the kind of latter half of a project or so, we prioritized a lot more heavily what we worked on. That was obviously a good way to kind of work out what you need to be doing. We made sure what we worked on was the stuff that was most valuable to W3C, and tried to get their team to work on other parts of it. We didn't use an agile approach on a project. That's obviously potentially on reflection could have been useful. But I don't know how many people use agile stuff and your web agencies as well, but it can be quite difficult to work on big kind of redesign projects where you've got a big deliverable at the end of it, and you can't just deliver part of it necessarily. But it's something I'd like to explore more in the future. So accessibility is obviously really important to W3C. They publish the standards and guidelines on these things, and it's something that we've cared for as an agency ever since I started. You might be aware accessibility guidelines have a bunch of different levels you can conform to. There's like A, AA, and AAA. Single A is like very basic conformance. AA is usually seen as the standard that most people go for. It's what most of the legislation around the world is based on. In the UK, public sector websites have to be AA compliant. And AAA is just an extra level. So things like if you're thinking about color contrast to make things like text really readable against colored backgrounds, AAA is just a bigger contrast effectively to make it really, really easy for people. So we used the same approach we use on most websites. We kind of, made sure definitely everything was AA compliant, but then we tried to make as much as possible AAA, because if we can't do it for people like W3C, who really has a chance of doing it at all? I guess with accessibility, it's also important to note depending on who your users are, would probably inform the kind of accessibility levels that you go for as well. But we needed to try and keep this as broad as possible for W3C. And we managed to make quite a few components AAA accessible, things like the navigation, which is obviously quite a critical bit of a website. And we had help as well, which is quite nice, from a few W3C experts, something else that doesn't tend to happen on normal client projects. People like Leonie Watson and Hidde de Vries, who are both accessibility experts in their field and involved quite heavily with W3C. They helped things like give us some guidance on how to do various bits of accessibility for front-end components, and help test bits of it as well, which is really helpful. But as an organisation, W3C don't have the time to do things like accessibility audits. That's not what they do. They write the specs that you can do audits against, but the team's too small to be able to do that kind of work. So we worked with an external agency. We worked with Digital Accessibility Centre based in the UK. And there's loads of these kind of testing companies out there. But if you want to audit your website or web products for accessibility, you need to work with specialist partners like this. And they're really helpful, especially if you kind of engage with them early. And that's one of the things I talk to people about when talking about accessibility, is it's really important to consider it from the start of projects and not treat it as some kind of add-on phase at the end, which is what often happens on projects on the web. If you do accessibility at the end, it's really difficult to kind of retrofit certain things. If you've got like custom components in React or something complicated, user interfaces, baking in accessibility is a lot easier if you consider that stuff from the start. It informed things, lots of things in the project, such as the HTML, CSS approach I mentioned earlier. And one of the other things is the CMS platform choice. And we kind of considered accessibility quite strongly in that. Yeah. And when I talk about accessibility in a CMS, Yanis kind of mentioned a little bit about this at the start, but it's not just about the front end, which we were very confident we could make accessible, and that was what we were getting audited by DAC, but it was the actual CMS editor itself, the actual back end effectively, and that's a lot more challenging to make accessible, because they're usually really complex user interfaces. So we basically did some CMS platform research as part of the project, again, all of which is published on the Working in the Open site. And we were looking at the PHP stack primarily, because that's essentially what the systems team are used to and what we knew they'd have to maintain in the future. And that's our specialism as well. So we reviewed a bunch of popular CMSs and tried to work out what would be best for a project. And we ended up with Craft CMS. I don't know if anyone's ever used this or heard of it, but it's a great CMS, really good for structured content, good for developers, has a GraphQL API, so it makes it quite easy to integrate. But the important thing for us wasn't just the features it had, it was actually that they baked in accessibility to their process and their workflow, which is quite unusual, we find, when talking to kind of CMS vendors. They kind of use accessibility as a kind of check whenever they're looking at new features. They hired an accessibility lead engineer, and that was during the W3C project, which is really interesting. And they still have one of them, which is fantastic. So if any of you work or are CMS vendors, having someone who leads the accessibility, or if you're creating products for the web, is a really positive step forward. And they publish stuff on the web. So this is an accessibility section on the website, and they post various updates. They, at the time, strived to try and make the editing system fully accessible by Craft version 4. They weren't able to do all of that, but they were quite transparent, and they did an audit, which they published on the web, so you can see exactly, where they're lacking and what they're trying to improve on, which is really good. And we had direct access to their team as well, which made it really nice and really easy to kind of get help on the project as we moved forward. Another thing we did which helped with accessibility was creating a design system for them. So obviously part of the work was creating a new look and feel for the W3C website. And we ended up publishing that as a design system, which is available on the web. It's essentially like a bunch of patterns and components, which we built the W3C website with, but the intention is that they can use this to build other websites as well. As I mentioned, W3.org is made up of hundreds of different websites. It's not just one, and there's loads of different groups. These 52 or so working groups that are involved in the standards process. There's loads of community groups that exist as well, and many of them create their own stuff, which is published to W3.org. And at the moment, it's a mishmash of various different things and styles. The hope is that in the future, people will be able to use parts of a design system to help build other web products within W3.org. And because we knew the systems team were going to have to integrate a lot of this stuff, this helped us document how to do that and made it easier for them to actually implement this stuff on the web. So it's as well as kind of having some consistency of design and making sure things look the right way for the website, it's helping the people actually build this stuff as well, which is important to us. And that's why the design system isn't just for the templates there and the code. There's documentation as well, and things like accessibility considerations, which we documented as well throughout the system. Some stuff was quite hard to build though. Navigation's a good example of that. It's often quite a complex part of a website. And we went through a bunch of different testing on that and quite a few different iterations. We wanted to kind of get that right and make sure it's fully accessible, because that'd be awful if we'd built a navigation system and people could, certain people couldn't use it. So we went through about 4 iterations, as I mentioned. Now we had a bunch of people, some accessibility users as well, who helped us test that, which is really helpful. We had things like this close button on the top right, which we thought might be useful for non-sighted users. It turned out it wasn't really. And there's other easier ways to kind of open close stuff with an HTML. Some of the changes were kind of mostly under the hood, so it doesn't necessarily look particularly pretty at this stage. We were kind of testing the accessibility side of it and how those interactions worked. And then we kind of layered UX and things on top of that, step by step, until we get a bit closer to what we ended up with, which is basically this. And obviously this looks a bit different on mobile. It compacts down to like a simpler menu. So one of the techniques we used when testing this was we just created static HTML prototypes. So it was really, really easy to kind of get that stuff updated, get it into a browser, and just ask some users to test it. This stuff was public on the Working the Open site as well, so other people were able to kind of look at stuff if they wanted to. Having like static prototypes is a really nice, fast way to do things, we find, rather than trying to build something into a CMS, which can obviously slow you down hugely. So keeping stuff simple is good. Internationalisation, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's an important part of W3C. It's one of their kind of key principles. And their current website is primarily English. And they've got individual pages sometimes translated. They currently have a couple of sites that are maintained by separate people and in Chinese and Japanese. But one of the ideas was to try and bring that stuff together and allow the Japan and China teams to actually manage content in Craft and then create it within the framework of a new W3C site. So there's 3 core languages effectively for W3.org, English, Chinese and Japanese, but they've got something like 25 other languages they publish content in. That's things like press releases, which obviously go out worldwide, sometimes blogs and news content. And that even includes right-to-left languages like Arabic as well, which we had to make sure that our design system essentially worked properly with that. We find, as an agency, when clients come to us saying they want translated websites, it's important to work out what you mean by that first, because in most of our experience, people have completely different requirements. For W3C, it seemed to be most of those requirements rolled into one a bit. So the traditional thing, having these like separate websites in different languages, the localized websites, was required for the Japan and China sites. But they also had translated pages within the English site that had to sit there alongside other stuff. But when we built them, you didn't want like the middle of a page in Arabic and the header and the footer in English, because it'd be really weird, especially since that's right to left as well, which would be a very confusing user experience. So we had to kind of have these embedded pages which were fully translated within the essentially linked to from the English side for things like press releases, which is the most common use case at W3C for translated content. And you also had things like inline localized content. You might have bits of French in the middle of a page. And again, we needed to make sure that that's tagged up in a proper way. There's ways to do that in HTML to say that's in a different language, which then tells browsers that, which then helps users. There's the user experience side of it as well. So there's a kind of guideline within the W3C standards called content negotiation, which is basically around automatically redirecting users to the language that you have a preference set in your web browser for. We didn't like that idea, and we have multilingual staff within Studio 24. We have Marie, who's from Belgium. She speaks a bunch of different languages, and when she goes to websites, she doesn't want just to be automatically redirected to, say, the French version. She might well want the English one instead. So we felt it's important not to automatically redirect people. It can be confusing as well sometimes. But we just opted to have really clear links to people, so you can see very obviously that there's a Japanese website and you can visit it, or if there's a press release, there's really clear links near the top of the page to all the different languages. So we think it's better to let users choose that kind of thing. There's the CMS management side of things, which can be quite complex sometimes, especially in CMSs that don't natively supporting different languages. That can be really problematic often. I mean, some CMSs have plugins to kind of enable that kind of thing, but we tend to find they're not massively reliable. So Craft did have native support for internationalisation, which made it a bit easier, and it kind of managed it via separate websites effectively, even though they're not literally separate websites all of the time. And this is what they look like. So this is essentially an English page, and one of the press releases actually, which as I said is the thing that they published most frequently in different languages. Currently the press releases are literally static HTML. They're not managed by anything at all. And then clear links to different languages, as you can see just up here. And importantly, using the actual language, the native language, to provide the link rather than saying it in English, which wouldn't be particularly helpful to anyone. There's the French version. You notice there's bits of English text dotted around. That's because the kind of text within the template that hasn't been translated yet, but this is coming from the beta site, but still in progress. Then the Arabic version of one of the press releases, so everything switches right to left. So in an early version of this, because this isn't a separate website and it's a translated page within the English site, when we first did it, we had English header and English footer, which meant that the English stuff was on the left and in English, and then everything was on the right. And then again, it swapped on the bottom of the page, which, as I say, was a very confusing kind of user experience. So we switched to do everything translated, which made a lot more sense. We had some help as well from another W3C expert, Richard Ashida, who's the head of our internationalisation side. And that was really useful, just to help kind of guide us and help tweak things as we move forward. So 3 challenges that just to sum up, we encountered on that project. These kind of things obviously affect most of our projects quite a lot of the time, but they're particularly complex with W3C. So at the end of what was quite a big project for us, What did we learn? So first, we learned it's really important to adapt to how large organizations work. Once we got into the swing of working in a way that worked with W3C, things became a lot easier. And as I said earlier, they're so used to remote working, that really helped kind of our working practices as we were kind of adjusting to being remote first, which in practice is what we are today still. Good communication is really critical, and it is of any client, but it's really important when working with a large organization like this. For 2 years, we basically met them every week, status update meetings, and when we worked with a systems team, we kind of became a bit of an integrated team, which was lovely. We had daily stand-ups, we used a shared Jira board, and that really worked really effectively. We also use Slack with W3C, which is not something we usually do with clients. So we use Basecamp, a project management tool, which we find quite effective to centralize communication. But Slack's quite a nice way just to kind of immediately chat with people. And they're used to this kind of stuff. I mean, W3C use IRC quite a lot, for example, and they're starting to use Slack more and more. So yeah, that's the first client we've tried that with, and so far it's been a good experience. As we progressed through the project, we learned focusing on what brings most value is really important. I think we went down the route of looking at too much initially, and it got bigger and bigger as you started talking to more people and realizing like how big some of these problems were to look at. But we obviously realized that you have to then focus in on what we can do well and then leave W3C's team to kind of do other parts of it. Focusing on what brings most value is an agile principle again. So it's something I'd quite like to do more of in the agency and find ways to make that work. As I said, I think it's quite challenging for agencies to do that often. It seems to be easier in like long-term projects within organizations. But if anyone has experience of that, I'd be happy to chat to them later. And I think it's good to take on projects that stretchy. I mean, this obviously seemed like a really big project. So, and I think at certain levels of like large projects, you know, there's going to be stuff that challenges most teams. I think we realized that as we moved on through the project. It helped us become more confident as an agency and more confident to take on similar work as well. And it helped, I think, grow the team members who are involved in the project, which is pretty much most of the agency at one point or another. Keeping your team motivated is obviously really important too. I mean, the project spanned 2 years, which is a long time, and it's not that. I mean, we do work with clients for a very long period of time, like Crossrail, which is the new London Underground Elizabeth line. We've worked with them as their digital partner for 13 years, but that's more of an iterative process where you kind of evolve stuff over time. Working on one project for the best part of 2 years is obviously quite a big ask for people. But you know, taking care of people is really important to me at Studio 24. We put a lot of work into kind of giving people flexibility, supporting them. We have things like mental health practitioners within the agency, which is really helpful. So I mean, and also within a pandemic, that obviously affected people in different ways. Not everyone had ideal home environments. We had this horrible thing in the UK where we had to do homeschooling. Someone with kids, it was incredibly difficult to kind of focus on work and be expected to do that stuff as well. So we had to be very, very flexible for that first year or so during the project. We did a few things differently. So we implemented things called governance meetings, where the project manager working on a project met with a bunch of management team, and we kind of just monitored how things were going, not just with the project and how successful things were going, but also with the team as well and how they felt. So we're able to kind of make changes as we went along. We gave people flexibility. We kind of set realistic expectations for them. We didn't try and like, you know, hammer them to get stuff done really quick or anything like this. So we gave them the freedom to do good work, which really helped in the end. So working in the open is hard. I think we found that a relatively tough experience, but it's something that's really valuable, and I'm really glad we did it. I mean, obviously, like today at the conference, it's good to share knowledge with others, and putting your stuff out there in the open as you work on stuff is obviously one really interesting way to do that. So yeah, we quite enjoyed engaging with the wider community and occasionally having these discussions with other people about aspects of a website. And it's good to kind of to learn from other people as well, because you can make your own work better. And it feels good to help W3C move forward. I mean, they're going through a bit of an organisational change at the moment. Even though they've been going for 30 years or so, they don't really have a kind of formal legal structure. They've been associated with these host organisations, universities like MIT, and research organisations like URSIM, based down in the south of France, which is where some of the teams are basically, the staff are based in these places. They're turning into a not-for-profit at the moment, which is supposed to happen next year. So it's good to kind of help W3C move forward. We hope as they kind of transform into this new organization, the new website helps them along that journey. And it's helped us as well, kind of transform as an agency. So this is the existing website, if anyone's ever seen it. Quite busy, lots of text. The new website looks like this, effectively. This is a snapshot of the current beta website. And on mobile, it's kind of even more kind of crunched text and difficult to read, especially if there's things like news articles or blog posts you're looking at. But as you can see, the beta site has this banner at the top, so the intention is to get active feedback from people as you move forward. I mean, there is a GitHub repo which is accepting kind of any feedback from people on this at the moment, which I think that's where the feedback thing links to. And 3 days ago, before Web Summer Camp, before coming here, I took the opportunity to go and visit them. So the very first time. It's down in Sophie Antipoli, which is in the south of France, near Nice. That's Coralie, Jean-Guy, one of the developers in the system team, and Vivian, who's the head of the systems team. And it's funny, because you know, working with a client for 2 years, and this is the first time I met them, which is really, really nice. So the beta website is effectively being finished off by W3C at the moment. They're basically finishing some data migration, which ended up being way more complex than they thought it would do, probably because they've got 20 odd years of stuff that's been added to in things like different news systems. And some content writing, and once that's finished, we're hoping the thing will be launched, hopefully by the end of the year. So fingers crossed. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Comments, questions, reflections. I really enjoy these case studies and hearing about you know, the real world problems that goes out there, and I think it's also really interesting to hear about a project that's out in the open, which is not usual. But thank you for sharing, Simon, also so openly with us. Let's hear from the first here.
Could you tell me, you said that you have adapted to the client processes and everything. Did they change anything from their side to adapt to you, maybe? Or learn something from you that they can use in their processes? That's one. And the translations are all done manually. Now, you weren't using any integration with some translation platform or something like that. Are the translation already done, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll touch on the second one first quickly. The translations are all manually written, as far as I'm aware. They've been doing this for decades, sorry. They've been doing this for a long time, so I think they have teams across the world that help with that. I don't believe there's any automated translation at all involved in that. I mean, the Japan and China team, in Japan and China, so they write the website themselves, that's the intention. But some of our clients use those kind of tools, especially to speed things up at the very least. And did W3C learn anything from us? I'm sure they did. It's a really good question. I think, so they're not very experienced with web projects, which is something I didn't realize when first working with them. The last time they redesigned W3.org, I believe, was 2008, I think. So it's a long time ago, 14 years or so. So I think throughout the project, they've learned things like, you know, prioritizing stuff and trying to like focus on what gives most value. If we, you know, future projects we might work with them, they're going to be a lot more focused, I think. I think when we started working with them, they had that attitude of we want all these things and we need to look at everything. And I think they've revised that a little bit, is my perception. So, thank you.
All right, another NetGen question.
Hi, Igor from NetGen. First question, so how challenging was for you to define a personas taking into consideration, you know, technical, you know, expectations both from the client and the community, and also taking the accessibility part?
Was that personas, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. God, that's so long ago. That was really, really early part of the project. I think that was the very first thing we did. And Ian Axton, our creative director, worked on that. I think it's one of the first posts on working the open site. As I recall it, you know, I can't remember exactly how challenging it was, if I'm being honest. But I do remember some parts of a project we kind of looked at in a bit more detail. It's like the technical reports page, the TR page. So if you go to w3.org/TR, that's where they publish everything. So that's where the standards for accessibility and CSS and other things are all published. It's a fairly dense page, it's difficult to understand. And when we redesigned that, we were thinking quite carefully that we wanted new people to be able to understand that, and lay people just to be able to go there and go, I want to see something about accessibility and I can find it. But also we're knowledgeable that it's used by experts. So there's a bunch of quite specific requirements they had, like they wanted everything to be on the page at once, for example, no pagination, because it's how they were used to using it. So we ended up talking to experts who used the TR page a lot, as well as trying to think of it from the perspective of new users, which was challenging. That took quite a while. We ended up kind of iterating that one as well about 3 or 4 times. I didn't touch on it in the presentation, but yeah, it's on the working paper site if you want to read more. But it was challenging, but interesting to work on.
All right. Anybody else? Did we have one more? There's a question over there, perhaps, from the crew.
Oh, cool.
Okay, I need to speak. Yeah, nice. Okay. First, thank you on the talk. I'm Borna from Netigen. The talk was really great, and you mentioned that everything was open source, and I guess that peer pressure from the community was really great, really high, even mentally for you. But do you accept pull requests or only comments on your code?
Well, I'm happy to accept pull requests on the stuff we do. I mean, we made things like Amplify open source because it works for us. So we work with a bunch of public sector clients in the UK as well, and they like to use open source stuff. And it's also easier for us for licensing. We don't have to worry about the client taking copyright of a website because we know that we own the bit that's open source effectively. So that stuff, yeah, there's pull requests and things like this. I mean, I help maintain like a WordPress config thing as well, which we accept things like pull requests on. The main W3C project, that's all open as well. So technically, anyone can go there, log issues, potentially contribute if they wanted to. Well, it's not up to us at the moment, so that's up to the systems team, basically. So we might advise them and talk to them about it, but it's up to W3C what they do. So technically, I would think they would be open.
But in process of development, you did not have any pull requests from the community on your project?
No, not really, no. That could have been something we looked at. It's quite hard to manage that, I guess, because you kind of, you're trying to develop a product or a website, and you need to kind of do that and finish it before then looking at stuff. So I suspect, like for Amplify, that would be easier in the future. But at the end of the day, Amplify is for us as well, so it's not for everyone. So I guess anyone with an open source project, you need a purpose, don't you? And you need a vision for it. So whatever changes needs to fit that vision.
Hi, Oliver.
Hi.
You mentioned about the Chinese translation as well. With a platform or website like that, did they have to face, or were you as an agency kind of responsible about the censorship there, about the regulations and regarding the content, what had to be published, how certain things had to be translated, had some content had to be changed just to fit the regulations there? I could imagine with a platform like that, there must have been some challenges, some contents that might have had to be changed. How did you deal with that?
I mean, to be honest, we didn't end up encountering that kind of problem because we weren't really working with the Chinese team. We built the system. We had some feedback from them as we were building stuff in the early days, but we built the system and the CMS to be able to manage that content. They're currently working on it, as far as I'm aware, so it's not something it's fairly early days, I think, for the Chinese site. But I'm guessing the current Chinese website is hosted in the US still. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a really interesting question. I mean, most of their stuff is standards-based and hopefully not too controversial, but there's bound to be stuff that they come up against, absolutely.
All right, I think that's all we had. Yeah, there's one more. One bonus question, Simon. You thought you were off the hook.
Yeah.
Hi, Nevin, Q agency. Before you were hired, how did you stand out from other agencies? And how does one pitch an organization like that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we went into it kind of passionately believing we could do a good job. I mean, as I mentioned before, we've always cared about accessibility. It's been part of our DNA for a long time. We had an accessibility lead in the agency, which helped massively because it showed we were serious about it. So I think we were just honest and tried to get on with them, like relationship building. We're lucky that there was an interview process, so we're able to talk to them. I think I remember very early on, like emailing and saying, can we chat? Because initially they were just asking for a proposal, but they're open to that, which is great. So yeah, try and talk to people as much as possible.
And if you go online, you can actually also find the winning proposal. Like
Ah.
you can see all the details.
Yeah, it's all online.
So it's all out in the open, pricing, the whole shebang.
Not the pricing.
Not the pricing.
Everything
But I
else
think
is
they
there.
had a budget indication, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
There was
But anyway.
there was an amount.
Yeah, and all the other ones as well are open, which is quite interesting for us from a research point of view.
Yeah. All right, I think that's all we had for Simon. If you like to talk as much as I did, please stand up and let's give him his first standing ovation in Croatia.